I read a book here earlier this year called The Wager. And The Wager is about a ship in the 1700s that was trying to sail around the Drake Passage, which is the most southern tip of South America. It's a great book, a book full of mutiny and shipwreck and scurvy. You can't say scurvy, nor you got to say it like a pirate. Scurvy, scurvy. And it was a great story, hearing all these sailors had to do to survive. They set out with, I don't know, like 500 people on ship, and they made it back with less than a quarter of the people left alive. So it was a pretty remarkable story of shipwrecks and all sorts of things. And if you're a reader and you like reading books, that would be a book I would recommend. It kept my attention all the way throughout. This past week, though, I was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about that book, The Wager. And to understand all that those sailors on The Wager went through, they were talking to other sailors, people who had been on ships for long periods of time. I know some of you know exactly what that's like, to be away from your family and be on a ship for a long period of time. And this is what one of the sailors said, trying to imagine what it would have been like to have been on the Wager when you're on the ocean and you're away from family for multiple years. They said, when you're a sailor, typically we build walls around ourselves to keep the sadness out, which also keeps out the joy. And I thought, man, if you could imagine yourself like away from your family, you're suffering with scurvy, you've got like mutiny and all sorts of things happening, like you could understand why you would want to build a wall to kind of keep that sadness out because it's just so pressing. But by doing that, you also keep the joy out, furthering your own suffering. Now, let's just acknowledge life can be hard. Sometimes we face hardships, and sometimes we respond just like those sailors. We want to build up walls. Man, I need to do anything I can to remove myself and protect myself from anything. And actually what we do by building those walls is we close ourselves off from joy and from rescue. I mean, I think we can all acknowledge in this room that life is hard. When you look around the world around us, we live in a broken world. Doesn't matter your color, doesn't matter your economic status. Life is just difficult and hard. In fact, this past week, I heard about a friend of mine, a kid I used to know years ago, used to do some ministry with, and he got married to the love of his wife, love of his life, had a little baby, and I found out this week that they got divorced, and I'm like, man, that's going to be devastating for them. They had their whole hopes and plans and dreams for the future. They had this little baby. And then divorce comes, and you're like, man, that's hard. I'm praying for a friend that we know whose sister was diagnosed with devastating cancer diagnosis. Man, that's hard. That's a weight. That's a burden. And then you look at our country, and like I'm not making a political statement here, but we've got politicians, and we've got families being found guilty of felony charges. Like, I don't really care how you vote. Like, we live in a broken country. It's pretty devastating to look around at what's happening around us. And not only do we deal with the darkness out in society, we also have to acknowledge we've got some darkness within our own hearts and our own souls and our own selves. And I had to acknowledge this week, I've been in this busy season. It's been very full. We've had a lot going on. It's been a heavy season. And I found myself, I don't know if you ever do this, I found myself being just really short with the people closest to me. Anybody else ever get into that spot where you're just tired and stressed and overwhelmed, and you're realizing I'm not responding well to the people, and I'm taking petty things and making them bigger things? Anybody else ever been in that situation? And that's the darkness that's all around us. Our world is a broken place with divorce and disease and death and scandals and economy and our own issues. And how do we respond to that? When you're dealing with that darkness, that difficulty, with that suffering, with that hardship, how do you normally respond to those things? Some of us, we try and do what that sailor did. We try and build a wall. Man, I just need to build a wall to keep all that bad stuff away and keep myself safe. I can feel pretty good. Other times, what we do is we grit our teeth, right? We roll up our sleeves. This is the American spirit, right? What we can do, we're going to go figure it out. We're going to go solve all the problems. And so what do? We have a relationship conflict. We have a problem at work. And what do? We grab a book. We're like, I'm going to find a book that gives me advice on how to overcome this situation. I'm going to be honest, I have a bookshelf full of those books. Because every time I face something difficult, I'm like, man, I got to figure out how to get through this. I'm going to come up with a book, and it's going to tell me how to do it, how to succeed and overcome whatever challenge we're facing. Now, let me just say it's not wrong to have those books. But when we're facing suffering, and we're facing darkness and hardship, are those our best options? To build a wall, to try and protect ourselves from further bad stuff happening? Or to just grit our teeth, learn some new things, and just try and solve it on our own? Or is there a better way for us to handle the darkness that's all around us and the difficulty in our lives? We're in the book of Micah, which, if you're not familiar with, it's in the Old Testament. It's one of the minor prophets, and might be hard to find, but it's in there, I promise. And Micah oftentimes is one of these minor prophets that sometimes can be confusing to understand because there's a lot of prophecy, there's a lot of judgment, there's a lot of hard things we read in the book of Micah. And sometimes when you're reading the Bible, you skip books like this or you just skim over it, right? But this book was written so we can actually know who God is like. So you want to know what God is like? We can find who God is in the book of Micah. And we've been in book of Micah for a couple weeks, and we've been through 2 chapters. And these 2 chapters, man, they've been pretty hard, right? The prophet has come in, and he's announced judgment on the people. There's this rebuke. The people, you're sinful. You've abandoned the greatest commandment. What's the greatest commandment? To love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. He comes in and says, you've abandoned that, and you've abandoned the second greatest commandment, which is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so Micah comes in with a message of judgment. He says to the nation of Israel, there's 2 nations, the northern and the southern. To the northern kingdom, he said, I'm going to make Samaria like ruins. The people are going to be captive. They're going to be taken away by an enemy. They're going to lose their homes. They're going to lose their lands because they have failed to love God with their heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then in chapter 2, to the southern kingdom, he says, God is going to allow an enemy to come and take your land. The land that's supposed to be a place of rest for you, God's going to allow an enemy to come and take that land and scatter you all throughout. And this is where we can understand, like for us, we recognize life can be hard. For God's people, life is really hard. Taken away from the land, facing judgment. There's personal suffering. There's suffering from the sin of others. There's national suffering. The people of God are in a hard time, a dark time, a difficult time. And that's what makes the end of Micah chapter 2 that was read for us this morning. That's what makes it so beautiful. Because in the middle of the existence of suffering and hardship and darkness and brokenness, in the middle of all that, Micah gives us a promise from God. A promise of hope, a promise of redemption, a promise of restoration, a promise of healing. And this promise is going to teach us today that when our world is dark, and it does get dark sometimes, when our world is dark, we don't have to build walls to try and protect ourselves. We don't have to try and figure out in our own strength. No, we have this promise from God that he is sending a breaker to break through that hardship and lead us to redemption and restoration and salvation. So that's what we're going to look at today. Again, in the middle of this suffering, Micah has this promise of God. We're going to look at this promise in 3 different parts. The first part of this promise is God is going to promise to gather his people, okay? Right? Again, context, because of their sin, because of abandoning God and failing to love God above all else and love their neighbor as herself, God has allowed an enemy to come in and conquer his people, to scatter them throughout the land. This is the judgment that God has brought upon them for their sin. But look what Micah says in verse 12. I, speaking about God, I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will gather the remnant of Israel. See what's happening here is God says, yes, I'm going to scatter you. You've abandoned me. You have abandoned me. You've abandoned my law. You've wandered away from me. And so God says, I'm going to allow you to wander into judgment. Yet in the middle of that judgment, he promises and says, I will gather my people. In fact, did you see that word? He said, I will surely do this. I will surely gather my people. This is not an if. This is not a hope. This is not I'm trying to. No, this is the promise of God. I will surely do this. Like it's different with different people, right? We're not talking about a leader who says, I'm going to try my very best to gather the people. We're not talking about a leader who says, my intent is to gather the people and I hope I can make it happen. Many of us in this room, we understand what it's like to have leaders who make promises to us that don't keep their promises. I promise to do this, I promise to do that. Listen, people are fallen. People are sinful. People don't always keep their promises, but that's not the case with God. When God says, I will surely do this, that means that promise is as good as done. This is who God is. He guarantees his promise. But I want you to notice, as he says, I promise to do this. I promise to gather the people. I surely would do this. Notice who it is that gathers the people. Again, it says, I will assemble. I will gather. Who's the one doing the gathering? God is the one who's going to do the gathering. This is huge. Because again, like we live in a society that we're so capable, right? We feel like, man, I'm going to be responsible for this and I'm going to be responsible for that. We're going through whatever situation we're in and we're like, man, I can fix it. I can make it right. I mean, why is Micah stopping right here to emphasize God's going to be the one who's gathered the people? Again, because who do we often turn to? We turn to ourselves, our own strength, our own wisdom. This is the American spirit. Pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, get her done. How often do we view like church and our faith with that same kind of arrogance? I can do this. I can make it happen. I can make the church grow. I can make the church good. I can make my faith strong. This is a fault of man. We continually think that we are the ones that are capable, that we are strong, that we're the ones that make the blessing or the success or whatever it happens to be. But look how Micah describes us as the people of God. He says in the second half of that verse, I will set them together like sheep to the fold, like flock to the pasture. Listen, what comes to your mind when you hear the term sheep? Like, I don't know, like I thought about this week and my first mind went to those Serta mattress commercials. You know those Serta mattress commercials, and they've got those cute little sheep that are jumping over and they count them at bedtime, and cute and cuddly. Or this goes back a little bit. Some of you may remember that Sesame Street, that sock puppet, lamb chops. Lamb chops. I won't even sing the song, but there's an underwear song about lamb chops. Terrible, I know. Look, sheep aren't supposed to give us this warm, fuzzy feeling. No, when Micah says we're like sheep, sheep are not smart animals. Sheep don't last long on their own. Sheep need constant help and guidance. And I think Micah's wording here is intentional. We as a people of God, we are sheep. We are helpless on our own. This is why in our darkness, in our suffering, whether it's a result of our own sin or someone else's sin, no, we need to turn to God, don't turn to ourselves. We turn to God because he's the one who gathers the sheep. He's the one who leads us to the fold, who leads us to the pasture. He's the one who redeems and heals and restores and blesses. Yet so often we live our lives thinking, oh, it's all about me. I just got to make it happen. And Micah's like, listen, you people in sin and darkness, you're not going to fix it. God's the one who's going to fix it. Micah's trying to boost their confidence and their trust in God, because that's where true hope is found. It's not found in our strength and our abilities. It's found in who he is. So the first part of this promise, God says, I'm going to gather the people. The second part of the promise is God is going to send a breaker, a king, to lead them out of captivity. In fact, here's what it said in verse 13. He who opens the breach goes before them. Now, I love that wording, he who opens the breach. But if you read this same verse in several different versions, Christian Standard Version, NIV, King James, It actually names the one who opens the breach. It actually says the breaker who opens the breach. It's a pretty awesome word, the breaker. In fact, I was trying to think, how can I give you a picture of what the breaker is? And so I thought about this baseball player from long ago, a guy by the name of Rodney McRae. Now, anybody know who Rodney McRae is? Nobody, okay? This guy was drafted in 1982, retired in 1993, and he wasn't a great baseball player. He played mostly in the minor leagues. I think he had 64 games in the major leagues. So he wasn't a great baseball player. But this is a guy, he is well known for one thing. Because there was a day he was playing a minor league baseball game. He was playing shallow center field, and the ball was hit over his head. So he turns, and he runs, and he runs, and he makes a catch and keeps running and runs right through the outfield fence. Like just bursts a hole right through it, right? Just breaks the fence completely down. That is a picture of the breaker. That is a picture of the one that God is sending. Here's the people of God. They're scattered. They're in bondage. They're in captivity by first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians. They're in exile. They're in the city. The enemies are out there holding them in. And what does God do? God sends Rodney McRae. God sends a breaker to break the gate open, to break the wall down, to defeat the enemy, to lead his people out of captivity. Isn't that a great picture? The breaker, to break down the captivity, to break down the bondage. The breaker, God sends the breaker out. See, we need to understand, again, Micah is all about who God is. God is a God of judgment. There is judgment for sin. But just as much as God is a God of judgment, he's a God of grace and mercy and compassion. And here he sends this breaker to go before them, to break down the walls, to break down the enemy, to break out, leading the people out of captivity. But not only does this breaker break down the wall to lead them out of captivity, this breaker is actually leading them to a certain place. He is leading them to freedom. In fact, listen to these words. Verse 13, the breaker opens the breach. He goes before them. They break through and they pass through and going out by it. And their king passes before them, the Lord at their head. You see who's in charge? You see who's leading the way? There's this breaker, this king, this leader who literally goes before the people of God. He goes before them. He passes ahead of them. He leads the way. He says, follow me through the gate. Follow me out of oppression. Follow me out of trouble. Follow me to freedom. Again, trying to figure out, how do I give you a picture of what this looks like? And the best way I can do this is 3 years ago, I took my boys on a hike at a place called the Enchantments. Now, most people take 2 or 3 days to hike through the enchantments, but I'm not most people, so we're going to do it in a single day, all right? This was a hike. It was 22 miles with 6,000 feet of elevation gain. It's a brutal hike. And we're on this hike, and we're like, we got about a third of the way, and we're at the base of what's called Asgard Pass. Asgard Pass was the hardest part of the climb. We had about 2,500 feet that we had to climb in about 3/4 of a mile. It is steep. It is steep straight up. And we get to the base of this mountain, and we're looking up, and there's kind of two options here. There's an option here on the right side that looks easier. It looks like, man, it looks like if you climb up there, there's a hole, and you'll make it through, and you'll make it up top to the lake. We're like, that's got to be the way. But there's also this other side, and it looks a lot harder. It's a lot steeper. There's not really a path up there. And we're looking at this, and I'm kind of like, I'm in charge. We're going up this way. I did have a map. I did pull it out. I'm like, we're close enough. So we start climbing up this mountain, okay? We're climbing, and it's getting hot, and we get about 2 hours up, and I pull out that map, and I'm like, uh-oh, I chose the wrong direction. We are way off course. We had navigated this mountain the wrong way, had to backtrack down, which was dangerous, and had to go all the way back down and re-climb up all those feet that we'd already climbed up. It was miserable. And the crazy part is, I had the map all along that told me the way to go. Now, let's just be honest. How many of us live our life in the same way? We long for freedom. We long to make it to the top of the mountain. We long to make it to the lake. We long for peace, whatever it happens to be. But we turn our eyes away from the one leading us the way to every other thing that we can think, oh, this is going to make me happy. What is it you're following that you think is going to give you freedom? Politics? Wealth? Retirement? Is a leader or mentor going to lead you to where freedom is? We make messes of our lives. We suffer and cause other people to suffer because we're following the wrong things. Now, we have a king who literally has gone before us. We have a king who is leading the way for us, will lead us to freedom. The question is, are we going to follow him? Are we going to pull it out to say, God, you've given me this book to know how to go. Are we actually going to open it and follow it? Or are we just going to say, man, this one looks easier here. I'm going to follow this one, this path. You see, this is a promise of God that he gave to Micah, to these people in the middle of suffering. They're in judgment. They've turned their backs against God. They're facing hardship, suffering their own sin and the sin of other people. And even in the middle of that darkness, even in that suffering, there's this promise. There's this promise of God that there will be a remnant of the people of God. They're going to get saved. They're going to be gathered together. They're going to follow this breaker out of captivity, out of oppression, out of bondage, out of sin, into freedom, into restoration, into healing, into peace. And in fact, this is our big idea of this message for us today. Here's our summary. So even when the world is dark, that the promise of God that gives us hope is that God is setting a breaker. God is sending a breaker to break us out of captivity and lead us to redemption and restoration and freedom and peace. And here in Micah's day, these people would have wondered, man, who is this breaker? We've been kicked out of our land. We're scattered into foreign lands. We're away from the people of God. Who's this breaker? Maybe it's going to be someone like King David, some military leader who's going to come and fight our battles. Yeah, we're going to get our land back. No, Micah looked further along than just a leader. Micah looked towards the one who was going to show up many years later in Jerusalem, calling himself the Good Shepherd. Micah was pointing to the one who wasn't just going to break through the gate of oppression, break down the wall of oppression. No, Micah was looking forward ahead to the one who was going to break through the grave and death and Satan and hell himself. No, Micah, as he talks about this breaker who's going to lead the way, is talking about Jesus, who loved a sinful people, who loved the people of Micah's day, who loved people like you and I, who turn our backs on God. He's looking to Jesus, who out of his love is going to choose to suffer the cross, to die in our place, and to rise from the grave victorious. So that when we look at our dark world, when we look at our difficult circumstances, our hardships, and our suffering, when we're in the middle of it, we can remember that the promise of God, the hope of God, is that there is a breaker who's gone before us to break through sin and Satan and death and hell. That this breaker has gone before us to say, follow me to freedom, follow me to healing, follow me to peace. Because our peace is not found in trying to build walls to protect ourselves. Our peace isn't found in us trying to be capable and strong enough in our own strength. No, our peace, our restoration, our redemption, our healing is found by putting our faith and trust in the breaker, in Christ, the one who came to break through, to lead us to these things. Now, I always wanted to be sensitive here because sometimes we can sit and hear a message like this about the breaker who's gone before us, the breaker who's going to lead us to peace. And we think, man, if I just follow Jesus, that means my life's going to be easy, right? Enemy want to sign up for that? I do. That sounds wonderful. That's not the way it works. We still live in a fallen world. But I don't know about you. I think I still want the breaker on my side, right? I want him on my side. I want the breaker working on my behalf, not working against me. So if you want to be on the side of the breaker, I've got just a couple of questions for you this morning. Number one, are you putting your trust and confidence in God or in yourself? Are you putting your trust and your confidence in God or someone else? A spouse? A parent? A mentor? A leader? What is it that you think is going to lead you to peace, to flourishing, to joy? Because in the very beginning, what happens in the Bible is we see Satan's tactic. His tactic in Genesis chapter 3 was to turn people's eyes away from trusting God and trusting into other things. If I can and this is a constant pull that we all have to acknowledge. There's this pull constantly on us to take our eyes off of God, off of Jesus, off of the things of God, onto ourselves, onto other people, onto other things. And the question for us is, if we're going to be honest, if we're going to be real, are we putting our trust and confidence in him and the things of God, or are we putting our trust and confidence in our own abilities and the people around us and the different things that we would turn to? And number two, if we are going to be on the side of the breaker, are you surrendered to God's leading and to God's ways? Again, I love this picture of the breaker leading the way. I have this picture of like a bulldozer just in front, just plowing the way. Follow me, follow me, follow me. Just follow the breaker all the way to freedom. Again, maybe this is just me, but does anybody else have a hard time staying on that path? I'm like, yes, I'm going to follow. Oh, look, there's a squirrel. Like maybe this is just me. But I'm like, God, I'm following you. God, I'm following you. Oh man, listen to those people over here. They keep talking about these different things that seem to make me so happy. God, I'm just going to go this way. Okay, God, no, I'm following you. God, I'm following you. But God, this leader over here, they love me and they tell me some things that they think is good. And God, I'm going to go this way. Oh God, I'm following you. God, I'm following you. But God, I look at the mountain and I'm like, that one looks so much easier than this one. So God, I'm gonna go for the easy one. Again, how many of us live our life that way? Proverbs 14:12 says, there's a way that seems right to a person, but its end is a way of death. How many times do we justify our sin, our anger, our bitterness, our lack of forgiveness? How many times do we actually destroy the people around us? Because we've turned our eyes off of God and his plan and his ways to these other things, even when we spiritualize it. I can make it sound spiritual. Look, that mountain looks so wonderful. I'm going to have a great time up there. As it leads me away from God and the breaker leading the way. This is why Jesus said, the gate is wide and the road is broad that leads to destruction, and many go through it. How narrow is the gate and how difficult is the road that leads to life. This is why at Restoration Church we say this again and again. We are a Bible people, which means God, he's given us a guide. He's given us his book. He's given us this to say, you want to follow the breaker? You want to know the way to freedom? It's right here. And the problem is, and I put myself in the same situation, is we are very good about knowledge. We know a lot of what the Bible says. Oh, I can spout memory verses, and I know this is what God says. But do we actually do those things? Do we live it out? Are we submitting when the scriptures challenge us to do hard things? Living the way that God calls us to live. In fact, I was thinking about this. I had a friend here a week or so ago. He was talking about how some family members, some friends come to him and say, hey, your marriage is so great. What's the secret? Like, what do you do? What do you do to have such a good marriage? Like what book did you read? Like what's the secret to making your wife happy? I'm like, I'd buy that book. And this is what he said. He said, my answer is follow Jesus. Because when I do what Scripture tells me to do as a man, guess what? My marriage becomes better. And when we submit ourselves to Scripture and say, this is what Scripture calls us to do, guess what? Our marriage is healthy. I can't tell you how to do it. I can say, just follow God and watch as God does some things in your marriage. Simply enough, are you surrendered to God's leading? Are you surrendered to God's ways? Are you surrendered to God's word? Let me ask you this morning. As you think about your life, about where you are right now, where do you need the breaker? Where do you need a breakthrough in your life? In fact, let me do something and make this a little bit awkward and weird. How many of you have a burden, some suffering, something that makes you feel captive, something that you are overwhelmed with and do not know what to do? If you're like, that's me, would you just lift your hand up? If you've got that burden, that weight, that thing that just bears down on you, you're like, man, this is such a weight. Listen, lift that hand up. Let's just make it weird. Listen, if your hand is up, I want you to know God loves you. I want you to know God sees what you're going through. He knows the burden. He knows the weight. He's not blind to it. He's not weak. He's not impotent. He knows what you are going through. And as you think about that burden you carry, I want you to know and hear the promise of God that He has sent a breaker before you to break the way. And I can't promise you, I wish I could. I wish I could promise you the breakthrough's gonna come tonight. I can't promise you that, but I can promise you this: as you look to Him, as you put your eyes on Him, as you depend on Him, He will meet you in the very middle of your burden. He will lead you through it. He will lead you to the other side. He will lead you to freedom. He will give you His peace. Whatever you are going through, look to the breaker. Follow Him through the breach, through the grate, through the gate. Let Him lead you to the place He's taken you. And I'm praying that your breakthrough is whatever you could imagine it to be. And if it's not, if God's end goal for you looks different than you imagine, I'm praying that you would have the peace that passes all understanding, that you'd have the hope that in eternity all things will be made right.